Hey, American government. No, you are world history students. My apologies. All right. Uh, this week we're going to be looking at the Crusades. So, we are in the year 1095. And just for context, this is roughly half a century after the Great Schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople, and the Latin Church, centered in Rome. We have the Byzantine Empire here. It's continuing to lose territory. Um, uh, Remember that in the 7th century, as Islam expanded out of Arabia, it quickly overran much of the territory in the Holy Land that at the time was controlled by the Byzantines. Byzantine being another word for the Eastern Roman Empire. By the time of this map, Islam had been in control of the Middle East, the Holy Land, and even a good chunk of the Iberian Peninsula over here, and also northern Africa, for several hundreds of years, as much as over 400 years. And as we get closer to this time period, we have the Seljuk Turks um, continuing to eat into the Byzantine Empire and taking over most of this peninsula here, which is known as the Anatolian Peninsula. Also, at this time, remember that we are in the High Middle Ages, which is a time when, especially in Western Europe, it's a time of increased agricultural productivity, increased population, and it's also in this context that the empire of the Byzantines and the empire is looking for help from the Eastern Romans. Okay, we have Emperor Alexios the First, the Byzantine Empire, sends a delegation, sends an ambassador to Pope Urban II, and he essentially is asking for mercenaries to help retake some of the Anatolian Peninsula back from the Muslims. Well, Pope Urban II sees an opportunity here, and it's roughly been half a century, 50 years since the Great Schism. He has his own internal struggles going on and struggles with some neighboring states as well. And he sees this potentially as an opportunity to take the focus off of him internally and put the focus elsewhere. So later that year, in November of 1095, he makes a sermon at Clermont in the Kingdom of France. And there are varying accounts of his speech, but this is one of them. He said, I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ heralds to publish this everywhere and to purse, which is another way of saying to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry and aid promptly to those Christians, so to the Byzantines, and to destroy the vile race from the lands of our friends. When he's talking about vile race, he's talking about the Muslims who have control of the Anatolian Peninsula and the Holy Land. I say this too to those who are present. It is also meant for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands it. So according to this account, he goes on to say that all who die by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans shall have immediate remission of sins. So this is the idea of indulgences, where, hey, you do something for me and I can forgive your sins. This I grant them through the power of God of which I am invested. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race, once again, he's talking about the Muslims, which worships demons, should conquer a people in which has the faith of omnipotent God and is made glorious with the name of Christ. Pope Urban's speech has an impact that's larger than even he expects. So throughout Western Europe, news of his speech news of his call to go and retake the Holy Land to fight against the despised and base race of the Muslims, this message really takes hold. And before the Pope is even able to organize a formal army, you have someone by the name of Peter the Hermit, who led what's called the People's Crusade in 1096. And this is often considered the first part of the First Crusade. And as they marched through the Rhineland, we'll see that here, which is it's now Germany, they massacred Jews in Germany, several thousand of them, and calling them Christ killers. They do this on their way to the Holy Land, and this is a theme that you will see throughout the Crusades. People not only just going after Muslims, but also going after Jews and pagans in northern Europe, Scandinavia area. So they're going through foreign lands, they're on their way to the Holy Land here, and they wreak a lot of havoc on the way. Sometimes they even fight the Byzantines themselves, the people that they are there to help. So this first People's Crusade, the first part of the First Crusade, was pretty much, by all accounts, very unsuccessful. By the time these people got to the Anatolian Peninsula, remember Peter the Hermit was leading this, and there were women, there were children, there were untrained peasants that were fighting. They were massacred by the Turks when they got to the Anatolian Peninsula. But eventually the Pope was able to organize a more formal, what eventually gets called the First Crusade, and once again it surpasses the Pope's expectations and far surpasses Alexios, the Byzantine emperor's expectations, and it's even a little frightening to him, where you have on the order of 100,000 soldiers coming from Western Europe, taking these various routes by land and by sea. And in 1099, they are eventually able to take Jerusalem from the Muslims. And in taking Jerusalem, most historical accounts say that it was quite bloody, with significant chunks of cities such as Antioch and Jerusalem being massacred. This is a later image of what it might have looked like when they conquered Jerusalem. And from that time period through most of the 12th century, they maintained control of the Holy Land. This is what the map looks like in 1135, and you might notice some changes now. The Byzantine Empire has reconquered parts of the Anatolian Peninsula, in particular the west and the north. And you see these blue sections. The blue regions, especially these ones here, are what are known as Crusader kingdoms. And if we can zoom in on these Crusader kingdoms here in blue, this is what we see. These are considered Crusader kingdoms, or Crusader states. And what's interesting about them is that even though these Western European Crusaders, now they weren't called Crusaders at first, but they wore a cross on their shields and they were eventually called Crusaders. Even though their goal at first was apparently to help retake lands for the Byzantines, when they were able to take the land, for the most part, they kept it for themselves. And they set up these Crusader states, or these Crusader kingdoms that you see here. And they're going to stay in control of these Crusader kingdoms for most of the 12th century. And as you get into the middle of the 12th century, the Muslims are able to take back a few significant cities, which is going to catalyze the Second Crusades. But then, as we get into 1187, the Muslim ruler Saladin is able to take back Jerusalem, which is, we'll see that in the next video when we investigate the Third Crusade. I should point out that, these Crusader states that were set up here, these Crusader kingdoms, oftentimes they lived near and around Muslims. And depending on kind of the situation or the circumstances for each locality, there were periods of peace between Christians and Muslims. It wasn't always uh, bloody and violent and volatile. Sometimes the cultures intermingled. Um, More about that later.